High up in the Yorkshire Dales, nestled between the rolling hills, you will find the village of Hawes. It's a stunning village, full of history and, of course, its famous cheese. As you go into the main car park, you will see Nidadale Museum and the train station with a steam engine waiting by, ready to depart with its pair of smart coaches. Looking closer, however, this steam train sadly isn't going anywhere. While everything from the building to the engine itself is very much genuine, Hawes railway station hasn't seen a passenger in nearly 62 years. To understand this line, we need to travel 6 miles away from Hawes and down the old track bed to Garsdale Head. Garsdale Head has less houses than a typical London street, but it has a rich and rather tragic history. The main feature of the hamlet is its station and junction that branch towards Hawes and the impressive viaducts which make up the Settle and Carlisle line. The station was designed by the Midland Railway Company's own architect, John Holloway Sanders, and opened to all on the 1st of August 1876. To accompany the new station and the staff, new houses were built and soon the little hamlet was born. As the large express engines thundered along the main line towards Settle, they would pick up water from their scoops from water troughs that sat in the tracks. The locals boasted that they were the highest troughs in England, and considering the hills the engine had to climb to get to the troughs, it was no doubt the fresh water was a welcome relief. For a station its size, it had a lot of unusual features. It had waiting rooms on both platforms and even a turntable. The hamlet didn't even have enough provisions for a church, so every Sunday one of the waiting rooms would be converted for Sunday service. The ladies' waiting room was also partially converted into a library. Nearly all who lived there served the railway in some form or another, whether they be drivers, plate layers or even signalmen. The highest point on the hill, Garsdale, was notorious, and pilot engines would station there ready to give the big engines a push. They would then run around to the turntable to turn around and get ready to push again. The turntable, which was exposed to the elements, was famous for whipping around in strong winds, taking an unsuspecting engine and its crew for a bit of an unexpected spin. Sleepers were built around it to stop this from happening, but the incident didn't stop a certain Mr. Audrey writing about it in his book, Troublesome Engines. On Christmas Eve 1910 at 5:30 a.m, a pair of light engines were waiting along the down line and were stopped by signalman Alfred Sutton. The engines were the last 2 of 9 engines that had passed through Alfred's stretch of track in the past hour. The 2 light engines, which had been turned on the turntable after helping the larger engines up Garsdale summit, were heading back to Carlisle to their sheds. As they waited on the lay-by loop that ran along the down line, they waited for a special to pass. When it did pass, Alfred signalled them on to the down line, where they were halted by the advanced starting signal. This was normal, as the express that had passed them had yet to clear Garsdale, and they must clear that section before they could enter. In the meantime, Alfred was busy handling 2 express goods trains on the other line. As he was dispatching the engines, he was offered the Scotch Express, a double-headed sleeping car passenger express on the down line. He accepted it and cleared the line for the express to pass. The drivers of the 2 pilot engines, which had been waiting at that very same signal for over 20 minutes, saw the signal change as their clearance to go, and they peeped their whistles in acceptance. Barely minutes later, the double-headed express thundered past at over 60 miles an hour. The 2 light engines were running at a steady pace when their drivers looked back and saw the express race out of the tunnels and bear down on them. Quickly they flung open the regulators and whistled. At the same time, seeing the tail lamp of the tender, the drivers of the expresses applied the brakes. Despite the best efforts of all 4 drivers and firemen, the express rear-ended the coupled light engines. All 4 engines derailed, and the coaches piled up behind them, each one collapsing into one another. Apart from 2, the coaches were lit by gas. The gas burst from the pipes, and within seconds the coaches were ablaze in a large flash, with the entire contents of the gas canisters escaping in under 2 minutes. By then the wooden carriages were well ablaze, with the passengers still inside. The flames were visible from Alfred's signal box. He swore to another driver who was waiting at the time they'd already sent the 2 light engines on their way. But when Alfred saw the flames, he asked the driver to alert the station master to tell him that he had wrecked the Scotch Express. The fire raged for 2 days before it was deemed safe to try and remove the dead. Out of the 56 passengers, 12 would perish. Many were severely injured, including the crew of the engines. The primary cause of the accident was put down to human error, with Alfred forgetting that the 2 light engines were there. Some blame was placed on the fireman and the driver of the 2 light engines themselves. They were held in breach of Regulation Rule 55, and they should have alerted the signalman if they were held for an unusually long time at signal. The time that they had to wait was not official, but all agreed that 20 minutes was far too long, and the fireman should have approached Alfred personally to advise they were still waiting. Both crews protested by advising that they had blown their whistles as they left. While this may have been true, it was concluded that this was not enough to alert Alfred that they were there. There is no evidence of Alfred's fate. However, it was later concluded that overwork and the fact that Alfred was finishing a 10-hour shift may have been factors in his forgetfulness. The prospect that Alfred was overworked was rejected in the official report, but many now feel that this may have played a part. Another factor was the gas in the carriages. It was recommended that shut-off valves be fitted to carriages that still carried gas. In addition, it was recommended that gas be phased out in favour of electric lighting. Finally, recommendations were made to the junction and the signal box itself. The signal box had recently undergone an overhaul, reducing the box to a single signal box instead of 2 separate ones. But the railway companies had failed to install track circuits. This simple electrical device, which had been introduced 38 years earlier, had alerted the signalman to when a train was in section, and more importantly, prevented a signalman to clear lines with trains that are in section already. The Midland Railway also failed to introduce lever collars, alerting to the signalman with a physical reminder that a train is waiting on the lever itself. Just these 2 simple devices could have prevented the accident. Improvements to the line were implemented shortly after the crash, but Alfred's signal box, the cottages and the station remains to this day. In 2018, quite by accident, some people working near the station discovered an old chimney. From photos, it was established that the chimney was in fact the funnel of the lead express engine, which had been hauled back to Garsdale upon its salvage, and had the chimney removed for fear the chimney would hit bridges when it was moved onto a wagon headed for Carlisle. It was moved to nearby Keighley Ribblehead, where it remains to this day as a memorial. The turntable was relocated to Keighley to be preserved, and the station still serves the Settle and Carlisle line. Garsdale will play an extra special part in saving the Settle and Carlisle line from closure. The whole line was under threat in the 1990s. Graham Nuttall, and friend of the railway company, set up a campaign to save the line. Graham used his own dog, Russwap, as the group's mascot, helping to sign petitions. In early January, Graham and Russwap went for a walk on the Welsh mountains and never returned. It would be a long 11 weeks before anyone would know what happened to the pair. On the 27th of April, Russwap was found severely ill but alive, standing guard over his owner's body and refusing to leave his side. Russwap passed away shortly after Graham's funeral, but their efforts saved the line, and 20 years later, both dog and owner were commended, not only for their efforts on the line, but Russwap's loyalty to his master, with a statue, and the station was refurbished. Leaving Scarsdale, and along the old single track bed and cuttings, a apart from the odd plate layer shed, you will see Mossdale Head Tunnel. Built in 1877, the tunnel spans 245 yards and was quite a considerable feat of engineering. Due to the terrain, much thought was given to drainage. Unfortunately, following the closure of the line, the tunnel has fallen into disrepair. The pressure of the surrounding soil is putting pressure on the walls and forcing the arch to rise. This in turn is loosening the bricks, and there have been several cave-ins. Moving away from the tunnel, the Mosshead Viaduct is the next structure you will see. Near to Mosshead Falls, the viaduct is a beautiful 4-arch viaduct that encapsulates the upper falls. The viaduct is 72 metres long and was built just after the tunnel was completed. The line boasts 2 viaducts, but the other is owned by a local outdoors athletic company who use it for abseiling. So now we travel to Hawes itself. Although its origins are not really well documented, the first record of a settlement was recorded in 1307, and by the 15th century there was enough people within the town to build a chapel. The town straddles the fast-flowing Gale Beck, and the Beck waterfalls are a tourist delight. The town was famous for many industries such as lead mines, rope making and textiles. At the centre of the town, providing the power, a watermill was built. The watermill was the beating heart of the town. It provided milling for grain, power for generators, and even till 1948 was the main source of electricity within it. The most famous export of this little town has to be the cheese. Yorkshire Wensleydale has been produced in some form or another going as far back as 1150. Its crumbly and mild texture has won hundreds of awards and brings over 250,000 people to the creamery every year. I've had the privilege of going to the Wednesday Creamery, and it's a fascinating museum, albeit a bit stinky. Heading back to the car park and the station itself, considering it's disused, the station still has a lot to look at. Although the station was built by the Midland Railway, both the Midland and the NER serviced the line until the grouping. After the grouping, it was considered not viable, and the last passenger walked through the doors in 1959. The line was kept open, but for freight only, but fell foul to the Beeching Acts in the 60s. The buildings are all original, and for a while were left to decay. After the Nidadale Museum acquired the site, the station and some of the buildings and fixtures were restored. The car park was once part of the small goods yard. There are 2 platforms, with 2 lines which allows for engines to pass at Hawes for the single line to Garsdale and Askrigg. The northern platform has a small waiting room, but the southern platform has a booking office and a much larger waiting room. The goods shed is still there, but the pens which the engines brought livestock and the coal office have been demolished. The station master's house still stands, as does an old weighbridge, indicating the site's former use. The closed station now houses local businesses and cafes. The engine that sits at the station itself has a bit of a story too. It carries the number 67345. But this was never the engine's true number. It is number 7845, a 060 tank engine built by Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne Works. Its job was to move heavy goods and coals at Hams Hall Power Station in Sutton Coalfield. It's not known why this engine was chosen for preservation, nor do we know who or what company did it, but it was found at Sheringham on the Norfolk Railway in the mid-70s. The engine was eventually moved to Nottingham for restorational works before being taken to Hawes to be a permanent exhibit for the museum. 67345 was added as this was the number of the locomotive war on the last day passengers set foot from the station. Most of the track, the tunnel and the viaducts are closed off to the public, with some parts of the line too dangerous to walk through. The tunnel in particular is at real risk of collapse and has since been turned into a shed for farming tools. Most of the land is privately owned with no public access, but there are groups out there campaigning for the line to be reinstated. One of them is the Upper Wensleydale Railway. It is still in its early stages and are looking to conduct a formal feasibility study. This will include buying the land the trackbed resides on, the cost of the tunnel and bridge repairs, the laying and maintenance of track, and of course the potential of profit versus outlay. It is hoped that with the new Beaching Reversal Act rejuvenating and breathing new life into forgotten and closed lines, that we can once again bring steam engines back to Hawes, and who knows, maybe 67345 may be able to finally leave the station.